Hi YouTube, it's Kathy and this is my June 2018 reading wrap-up. If you're not already aware, I do weekly wrap-ups of everything I read, watch, and listen to, but today we're doing just the books for the month of June. I'm going to start with my nerdy, hardcore stats and charts and then get into what I read. In June I read 22 books for a total of 6,177 pages. That takes into account converting audiobook minutes to pages, so 2,166 of those pages were actually 49 hours of audio. The age breakdown for these books was 11 adult books, 10 YA books, and 1 middle grade book. I read 16 novels, 4 graphic novels, and 2 anthologies. This month I read a little bit of everything, with contemporary and fantasy taking up about half the pie, followed by nonfiction, science fiction, historical fiction, mystery, and poetry. If you adjust for the amount of pages in each genre, the chart kinda stays the same. Most of these books, no surprise, came from the library, but I also reread an audiobook I already had. I read 8 paperbacks, 7 hardcovers, 6 audiobooks, and 1 ebook. More than half of my books were in the 300 to 399 page range, and more than half of them were published this year or last year. Most of these books were by female authors, and about half of the protagonists were female, with some non-binary folk, ensemble cast books, and books where there was no protagonist thrown in. I read books set mostly in the United States and other worlds, but also touched Greece, Iraq, Finland, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Canada. In terms of diversity, it's no surprise that the biggest slice of the pie is queer content, given I co-hosted the Queer Lit Readathon this month. This month was kind of a mixed bag as far as star ratings go. This month I had 2 2.5-star reads, 4 3-star reads, 2 3.5-star reads, 9 4-star reads, 3 4.5-star reads, and 2 5-star reads. Let's start with the lowest rated read and work our way up to the highest, shall we? Obviously, since we have 22 books to get through, I'm going to try to be brief because we don't want this to be an hour-long video. But what I will do is link down below all of the weekly entertainment wrap-ups where I talk about these books in more detail. Starting with my 2.5-star reads, I read Frankenstein Baghdad. This was actually one of my top anticipated books for the year because it sounded really interesting. The way I first saw the premise is that there was somebody collecting body parts around Baghdad and putting them into one body as a political protest of the war. And then of course the body disappears and chaos ensues. Although the second half of that synopsis is correct, the first part, it wasn't really for a political protest. In fact, it didn't even seem like the character knew why he was collecting body parts. In addition, for a very short book, this novel had way too many characters and it was hard to keep track of them and really care about any of them. So although how this monster came to be was kind of interesting, I kind of lost interest. Additionally, the character that became somewhat like the protagonist was in love with somebody he didn't really even know, and that whole side story was just weird. It's an interesting concept for a Frankenstein retelling, but it just wasn't for me. Speaking of also not for me, I read Odyssey Volume 1 by Matt Fraction. This one is an Odyssey retelling where the entire cast is gender-bent and it is queer. That sounds like something that would be right up my alley, but as I learned while reading this and others this month, epics just aren't my thing. Again, it's another if there are too many characters with too many names and I don't get to really meet any of them and care about any of them, I lose interest really quickly. However, the art in this comic is amazing. You could spend a lot of time just staring at all the colors. There is more than one volume of this, so I highly recommend that if you are a person who likes epics and doesn't mind the whole too many characters thing, definitely read this series. On to my 3-star reads, the first one being The Radical Element, which was a short story collection. All of these stories were set in the United States, and the tagline on the book actually explains it pretty clearly. In an anthology of revolution and resistance, a sisterhood of YA writers shines a light on a century and a half of heroines on the margins and in the intersections. This was a pretty good anthology. It had a ton of people I'd heard of before, a ton more people that I want to read more of their stuff, and it had a lot of different diversity within the different stories. As a collection, it didn't really wow me, but at the same time it's really hard to do that with a short story collection. If you want to read stories about women being badasses and fighting back, this is the place to go. My next 3-star read was Keep Her Safe by Sophie Hannah. This is a thriller concerning a woman named Cara who runs away from her UK family to resort in the States for a couple of weeks and ends up embroiled in this decade-long missing child investigation. And that's kind of all I want to say. I don't want to spoil any of the little plot points because I found them kind of interesting. But slowly you learn why she's run away from her family for this 2 weeks by herself. You also learn why meeting this random person is probably very significant. And it's that kind of read where if you just suspend your disbelief at how the justice system actually works, it's pretty fun to read. Everyone needs mind candy from time to time, and this is definitely that. My next 3-star read was My Cat Yugoslavia. This is a dual narrative between a mother in the 1980s in Yugoslavia and her son in Finland 20 years later. They are Muslim immigrants, he is queer, and there's some weird magical elements to this, such that he lives with a talking cat for a while, who's kind of a jackass. There's also some symbolism with snakes in this book, and I could guess what that means, and I kind of want to look it up, but at the same time I like letting a work speak for itself. I don't exactly have time to do a deep dive into all 22 things I read in a month. At the heart of this book is about love and acceptance and wanting to be who you are. My final 3-star read was Circe. Now, I am very scared about saying that I only gave this 3 stars because everyone loves this. However, for me, I don't enjoy epics, so it's my fault I didn't like this as much as everyone else. That being said, I didn't hate this book. I actually really enjoyed the writing. It's just the fact that there were so many characters, it was over so many generations, and just the way it was framed doesn't work for me. I'm so scared. I'm not actually scared, but there are people whose opinions I really, really respect, and I know that they really love this book, and I don't want them to think that I'm a terrible person, because I'm not. It just, epics don't work for me. This one, if you haven't already heard of it, follows Circe, who is a goddess, the daughter of Helios, as she's exiled, and her very long story through Greek mythology. And the thing is, each of the stories was interesting, and all of her interactions with these different gods and different magical beings were really interesting. And I think that I would have connected with it more if it was written as a series of short stories from her life instead of one long narrative. But that's just how my brain works. On to my 3.5-star reads, the first one being Midnighter and Apollo, which is a comic book about a romance between Midnighter and Apollo. Midnighter has a fight computer in his brain, Apollo is named himself after a Greek god. They're in love, something happens, I don't want to ruin it, and one of them has to go on a very epic adventure. I really enjoyed this. It was great to see a romance between two men in a comic book, which is not something you see very often. My other 3.5-star read this month was a poetry collection called Even This Page Is White. This is actually a fantastic collection. I just never really know how to rate poetry, which is probably why it's so far down in star ratings. It should probably be much higher because the poems within this collection were rather impactful, and even the way the poems were written on the page were rather impactful. Instead of taking up the entire page with text, the author tended to use just the very bottom of the pages, and usually in just one little corner, which speaks a lot to the subject matter at hand. If you're a person who enjoys poetry and enjoys dissecting poetry, and especially how it appears on the page, you will absolutely love this collection. On to my 4-star reads, the biggest category, fortunately, so I did have a pretty good reading month because of that. The first book in this category is Goldie Vance Volume 1, which is a detective novel set in, I believe it was the 70s, following a character named Goldie Vance and her troupe of people who also work with her at a hotel that her father runs. This was a fun little mystery that kind of had Scooby-Doo vibes, but a little bit higher stakes, and there was a female-female romance by the end of the volume, which is fine by me. Next on the list is From Here to Eternity. This is a book about traveling the world to see different death cultures and finding the good death, which is kind of funny because this month I did travel and I did find the good death, which is Caitlin Doughty's social media handle. I found her at VidCon and I told her I just read your second book and I really enjoyed it. The biggest takeaway from this book for me is that every culture thinks everyone else's death practices are weird and gross. And I wouldn't say that anyone is necessarily wrong. Anything could be weird and gross depending on how you frame it. But as long as what you're doing with your dead is done with respect and love and isn't breaking any laws, go for it. The next book on my list was a reread which you might have heard of before because it's Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Philosopher's Stone if you're here in North America, because the States was just afraid of everyone becoming witches, apparently. Goddamn America wrecking everything. In any case, I had to reread this for my local Nerdfighter book club because we decided to pick a book that everyone had already read to read and discuss, because it seems like there's a point at every meeting where we end up talking about Harry Potter anyway, so we figured we'd get it out of the way. For me, this is the first time I'd actually reread this book. I read all 7 of the books back in January of 2013 for the first time for all of them. And what I found interesting was going back and seeing how many names she had just dropped into this first book. For example, Hagrid borrowed the motorcycle from Sirius. In any case, I'm reasonably certain that you already know what this book is about. It was a good time to reread. We had a really fun Harry Potter themed book club, because I love when hosts love a theme. Next is Spellbook of the Lost and Found. This one is set in Ireland and concerns some girls who lost their diaries and find this spell book and try to bring them back. Obviously with magic, something goes awry, things are weird, people are trying to figure out what's going on in this small town. And obviously, given I gave it a 4-star, I really enjoyed this book, but something I wanted to touch on, which I touched on when I talked about it in my weekly wrap-up, is it didn't feel like this was set in Ireland. There is a really good chance that, like Harry Potter, this one was scrubbed and made more American, but I don't know for sure because it's not like I have 2 different editions to look at. It was just in the little details of them playing soccer instead of football, them looking for aspirin instead of paracetamol. I think they also might have talked about flashlights instead of torches. It was just weird little details like that that I assume were changed, and because of these changes it felt like this was set in a small town in the United States instead of being set in Ireland, which is a shame because I was looking forward to having a book set in a place I used to live. Rant aside, I really enjoyed the characters, I really enjoyed the character development, the writing was really nice, it was just those little details that just took me right out of the book. Next on my list is Far From You by Tess Sharp. This one is about a girl who has been in rehab for the past 3 months, and previous to that, her best friend had been murdered. Because the police found drugs in the jacket pocket of the protagonist at the crime scene, they assumed this was a drug-related offense and were looking in the wrong place for the killer. Now that she's returned from rehab, she is trying to find out who killed her best friend. I really enjoyed the mystery element of this, as well as it kept going back in time and showing us more and more of the relationship between these best friends and how it was more than that. Not to mention the protagonist was also dealing with a chronic pain issue, which is why she had become dependent on drugs in the first place. There were many perspectives in this story that I appreciated and enjoyed reading from because they're not my perspective. But at the same time, there were things that I could definitely relate to. Next is Not Your Villain, which is the second in the Not Your Sidekick series, and it's great. I can't really say too much about the plot because again, it's the second in a series, but this is in a world where some people just have superpowers. Generally, superpowers are something that are inherited, but not everybody who has parents with superpowers also gets superpowers. And it's also not the case for our protagonist, who has nobody in their family who's a metahuman, and yet they have some really cool superpowers. As far as rep in this book, there is a ton of different queer rep of both the main character and several side characters. And I will always be excited for every additional book that comes out in this series. Next we have Lizard Radio. This is about a character who is sent off to an agriculture camp to try to conform to gender norms before they turn 18, because if they haven't conformed by then, they will be sent to live in this city where all the misfits of society go. I actually mentioned to an agent friend about a week ago that I had read this book recently, and they got really excited because they were like, I've never heard anyone else talk about this book. And I was like, yeah, I had never heard of it. I found it on a very obscure list of queer books. This one not only talks about gender confusion, but sexuality confusion. And then also has this strange sci-fi bent to it where you don't know if this person is actually kind of an alien or not. It's one of those books where it's really kind of hard to talk about without just explaining everything from the premise, and I find it's more interesting for me personally just to start reading something like this and figure out all of that as the author laid it out. However, I did explain basically everything from the premise in my weekly wrap-up, so if you want to hear that before getting into the book, you can definitely do that. The next book is Pantomime by Laura Lamb. This one was sold to me when somebody said it's like The Night Circus, but queer. And instead of being focused on magic, the main character actually works as an aerialist at the circus. There are magical elements in this world, and the main character is intersex. If you like magic or you want more diversity in your queer reading, this is definitely a book you should pick up. I'm going to continue this series at some point. The last of my 4-star books is Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. This is a nonfiction book about a group of indigenous people in the United States who owned the land rights to an area that ended up being very wealthy as far as oil goes, and then also the people that were killing them off systematically so they could inherit all of their money. This book was full of primary sources where people were calling people what they would have called them back in the 1920s, and there was a lot of racist terms that I had never heard of before, thank goodness, and it made me really, really angry and really upset, and because of that, it's a very important story for everyone to read. On to my 4.5-star reads, the first one being Lola and the Boy Next Door. This is another point where I fear a little bit of hate, because yes, I know and accept that this book series is fluff, but that's exactly what I needed. After the high volume reading I did hosting 2 readathons back to back, and then also all of the energy I expended at VidCon, I needed a palate cleanser to get back into reading, or else I was just going to have a giant slump, and this did that exactly. This is a book about a girl named Lola who has 2 dads and used to have the biggest crush on her next door neighbor until he moved away and kind of broke her heart. Now she's dating a much older guy, and her old neighbor comes back into the neighborhood. Obviously you can kind of guess how it goes from there based on the title and based on tropes, but you know what? I really enjoyed this book. The writing is nice and clear, it made me feel some things, it made me really ship the characters, and it kind of gave me the energy to keep reading because I was really tired after this 3-week section of my life. The next book in this category was Herding Cats. This is a graphic novel, and if you've been on Twitter or Tumblr, I imagine you've probably seen some of Sarah's scribbles before. I find her work endearing, incredibly relatable, and I always love that there's a section at the end that's kind of like an essay about whatever she wants to talk about, basically. I love her work and always wish that these volumes were like 3 times as long because they make me laugh so hard. The final book in this category is Openly Straight by Bill Konigsberg. This one is about a boy named Rafe who is known for being one of the gay kids at school. He feels that this label is very overrepresented in his life and it's the first thing that people know about him and they don't tend to get to know him any further than that. So he devises a plan to move across the country and go to an all-boys boarding school where he is going to not be out of the closet. He doesn't feel like he's going back in the closet because people know he's gay, but he's also not giving people that information. He goes into this with the intentions of not outright lying about his sexuality, but it comes up a couple of times and he has to say, oh yeah, I definitely had this girlfriend. Yes, girlfriend. Yes. This of course becomes incredibly complicated when he falls for one of his friends. I'm going to talk more about this in my next weekly wrap-up, but I really enjoyed it. I understand the protagonist's reasoning behind wanting to scrub that label. Yes, it is a big part of who he is, but often I find that if there is a big part of who you are, it feels like that's the only part that people see. And I've definitely had a fear like that before. I've had a fear of people only seeing me as the person who gets really sad in the winter because I have seasonal affective disorder. I don't think that anyone likes the idea of being stereotyped and put in one specific box when there are so many different facets of a personality. Needless to say, this is a queer book that if you haven't already picked it up, you definitely should. And on to my 5-star books, the first one being Let's Talk About Love by Claire Kahn. This one has my heart. This book is about Alice, a biromantic asexual girl whose girlfriend has just broken up with her because she won't have sex with her, or at least not the enthusiastic sex that the girlfriend is looking for. Alice has some problems talking about the fact that she's ace, and she decides that maybe dating just isn't for her. That feeling gets turned on its head when she meets a coworker who is very cute. Like, she has a scale of cuteness and he's broken the scale. I had an absolutely fantastic time reading these friendships, relationships, different dynamics. There are points when people just don't understand Alice, and there are points where Alice actively hurts other people. And each of these issues is worked through in such loving ways. Another aspect that I absolutely love is Alice is in therapy, and this is a very open part of the book. She has so many people in her life that love her but don't necessarily support her, and it's very important that she's found these different support systems. On the surface, this book can be about love, but then it's about so many other things. I absolutely adore this book. The cover is gorgeous and you should just read it. The last book on my list this month is American Kingpin. This was such a good recommendation. Did you know that at some point in recent history it was possible to buy and sell any type of drug on the internet using Bitcoin and Tor? I didn't, because that's not a thing that's relevant to my life, but that definitely happened, and this is all about that criminal case. I love crime shows, I love true crime, but what I love the most is narrative nonfiction, especially when it's true crime. This book is written very much as though it's a novel, but it's actually talking about real people, real interactions, what actually happened. And so much research went into just getting the right mood, so much so that weather reports were looked at so that the author could know if it was raining that day and could write that in. If you are at all interested in true crime, definitely pick up this book. It was fantastic. If you want to hear more about these books, or other books for that matter, the playlist for my weekly entertainment wrap-ups is always listed down below. If you've read any of these, let me know about it down in the comments below. On the way down to the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you very soon. Bye!